So I'm really so delighted to talk with you today. I wrote a piece about the Palliser novels a few years ago. I'll put it in the chat later, but I was very, very interested in these books, and it's a delight to be able to go back to them. So I just thought I might start by recapping the story so far. Dominic, is my voice level okay? Okay, great. So as you know from last time, the excellent introduction by Professor Birch, Alice's dilemma is, what should a woman do with her life? She's broken off with a worthy suitor, John Gray, who's chivalrous but unyielding. There's no give and take between the two of them. And cousin Kate is trying to pair her back with George, who Trollope introduces as a wild man versus a worthy man. And George has also kind of been working on her about how he always thought of her as someone of fire, not milk, and how can she possibly be happy with someone like John Gray. And Alice is really in a dilemma because she envies Kate, her ability to be interested in George's career. She herself hankers after some kind of political activity, maybe secondhand, and she thinks, is there something more than being a wife and having children? And Trollope refers sort of to an actual phenomenon of the time, the learned ladies that have encircled her, who are kind of advocating all these various ideas that might suggest that something other than wifedom and children are appropriate for women. So she regrets her decision from John Gray almost as soon as she makes it, and she even refers to it as a fall from heaven. But she doesn't change her mind. And just as she's on the verge of changing her mind, her often absent father fails to come home in time so they can have a crucial conversation. And the next morning, she goes off as planned to stay with one of her relatives. But meanwhile, Mr. Gray does not accept the engagement. It's over. And here's just a photo from the Pallisers, and I actually got this from Ellen's blog. Just a still from the Pallisers, the BBC series. Let me just go to the next slide. I think, okay, so then meanwhile, Aunt Greenough and Kate gives us this kind of comic, this comic marriage plot, which interestingly, if you've ever seen the Pallisers 1974 adaptation, they just totally get rid of this plot. They just leave it out. But it's quite funny. And Kate's aunt is a woman of means. She's a widow with 40,000 pounds. She makes a big display of her mourning, but it's sort of comical. And Kate is a favorite her aunt. Her aunt is very liberal and generous. And the aunt has two suitors, Mr. Cheesacre, stolid and stable. And then there's Captain Belfield, kind of charismatic, kind of sexier, but kind of unstable and a bit of a scamp. So the aunt, meanwhile, has her own game, and she's thinking, why not get Mr. Cheesacre to fall for Kate? And of course, Kate makes a big joke about this to Alice, but it has no real interest in Mr. Cheesacre. And frankly, Kate seems to have no interest sorry, make my slides more full. No interest in marrying, period. Okay, she was really devoted to George. At one point in the book, she says, I'm married to George. Okay, so in this set of chapters, we get more comical scenes of Mrs. Greenough and how she manages her two suitors. She has great skill in managing both of them, and she receives marriage proposals from both of them in the same chapter. But her comical grief over her beloved Mr. Greenough, she says, she can't possibly think of accepting one of these offers. So with Mrs. Greenough, we get a really interesting picture of the comparative independence of a wealthy widow in Trollope's time. Okay, so back to Alice. She sees Mr. Gray and admits her sin, but she still doesn't have any intention of marrying him. Her friends, her great relations, all disapprove of her conduct. They can't believe she would turn down this worthy man. She's advised by her father to grow like plants toward the light and to go spend time with Glencora at Matching. And even though he personally hasn't really been accepted by Alice's noble's mother's family, he still urges her that there's something to be said by hanging around with noble people, and you kind of get some kind of status by hanging around with them. So this is a way that the plot connects Alice and Glencora. They're meeting together at Matching. The Duke of Omnium has given her these cute ponies, Dandy and Flirt, are these horses, and she picks Alice up, and they're visiting together. So while Alice is at Matching, Glencora half concocts this idea that maybe Alice could marry Geoffrey Palliser. And at that time, Glencora is sort of embittered that she hasn't been able to get pregnant, and she may not be able to bear her husband an heir. And then Geoffrey will, if he gets married and he has a child, and he could be the one. And so there's some banter about that. But basically, Alice and Glencora are brought together at Matching. Now, another marriage dilemma is poor Lady Glencora. Here's a photo from the BBC. Pallisers. Alice's cousin, Glencora is Alice's cousin. Alice is aware that Glencora loved Burgo Fitzgerald, who's beautiful but a very risky prospect as a marriage partner. She's pressured to marry Plantagenet, who the narrator describes as dull. Dull in his political life, but useful, extremely useful and serviceable. Very dull in his married life. Now, to the outside world, this marriage seems to be a tremendous business success. You got a wealthy heiress, brought her together with a man who's on the rise, a rising man who's going to be one of the most powerful people in the country when his uncle dies. But internally, Plantagenet is pretty happy. There's an amazing chapter where Trollope tells us that he was pretty satisfied with his marriage and satisfied with his wife, but Glencora is miserable. She hasn't been able to become pregnant, and she thinks, if only I had a child, I could bear all this, right? She's very miserable. She needs someone to love and pet her. Plantagenet is working until 3 a.m. doing the blue books. And as one commentator once wrote, it's no wonder they don't have a child yet when he's up till 3 a.m. doing political work, right? There's a scene where Alice says, Glencora says to Alice, he'll probably be up another couple hours. He's always working. So anyway, Glencora still loves Burgo. She has this dramatic statement to Alice, by law, I am his wife, but the laws are liars, right? And then we have that dramatic priory scene where Glencora confesses her misery to Alice. She doesn't want to run off with Burgo, but she kind of fears that she may not be able to resist temptation. Plantagenet doesn't credit it when she tells him that she doesn't want to see Burgo. And he's like, but it's convenient to me that we will go there, and you have to just get over this. And the narrator tells us that when Glencora earnestly tried to tell Plantagenet, I'm in love with this person, he just thought, well, girls do fall in love, I guess, and she'll just get over it. So he really has no idea how miserable she is. And she's confessing it to Alice, and it's this romantic, cold evening by moonlight. And she says, I loathe myself, and I loathe the thing I'm thinking of, which suggests that she's thinking, could I really become Burgo's mistress? Could I really leave? I mean, what Glencora really would like to do, but the law doesn't allow it, is get out of this marriage. She hasn't been able to have a child. She thinks if she could disappear, Plantagenet could get another spouse and have a child with that spouse. And she feels deeply pressured. She feels that she was compelled into this marriage. Everybody kind of ganged up on her, and she would rather have chosen Burgo and be miserable, even if he spent a lot of her money, than have to be in this kind of cold, loveless marriage. Now, Trollope in his autobiography wrote that it's not wrong to save a girl from wasting herself and an heiress from wasting her property on such a scamp as Burgo. In fact, it was the duty of the girl's friends. And here we see a still from the Pallisers. This Burgo kind of looks like the guy that used to play Bobby Ewing in Dallas, by the way. Anyway, but Trollope says it must ever be wrong to force a girl into marriage with a man she doesn't love, and certainly the more so when there's another that she does love. So Trollope says in his autobiography that Glencora had a great wrong done to her, right? And as this novel is kind of a chance for him to work out what happens in a situation like this. How do people cope with this kind of difficulty? Now, Plantagenet wasn't deeply in love the way that Glencora was, but as the narrator alludes, he had his own kind of possible fall into temptation. Some of you may remember from the Barchester series that Plantagenet became enamored with Griselda Grantley, then Lady Dumbello, kind of this remote, beautiful woman who was kind of the beauty of the season. And he sort of was flirting with her to the extent he could flirt. But then the Duke got wind of it. And because the Duke had had an illicit relationship with Lady Hartletop, it just wouldn't do that Plantagenet was kind of lusting after this married woman. So the marriage between Plantagenet and Glencora was prudent in terms of getting him more on the right path and saving her from making a mistake with Burgo. But she's deeply unhappy. He, as yet, is pretty clueless to her happiness. And you see the way she's treated like a child. She jokes about her duennas, Mr. Bott and Ms. Martham. She had Marsham, these people who watch over her and report about her every move. So Alice finds her deeply unhappy. And to Glencora, it's sort of unfathomable how Alice loves someone. She actually loved John Grey. Why would she break up with him? So she can't really fathom Alice's behavior. And here's Alice telling Glencora, you have to be true to your marriage vows, where Alice had not been true to her engagement vows. Okay. Now, of course, it wouldn't be Trollope if we didn't have the obligatory hunting scenes and camaraderie of the hunt. And so this, I was saying to Dominic, this is just a carnival of chapters. We have the Oileymead, and Kate and the aunt. We have Alice and her scenes with Lady McLeod and the showdown with Midlothian. And we have Glencora, and we have the political dinners, and then we have the hunting scenes. And it's really interesting in these two chapters, and I want to talk about it a little more with you during the breakout rooms, the tyranny theme. On the one hand, Trollope tells us that there's a tyranny of some men over other men, and he illustrates with certain men who are just regarded as inferior to other men, even though on objective indicators, it's not obvious why they would be viewed as inferior. And the narrator can't explain why. And he even talks about tyrant boys. And the editor's notes from Professor Birch suggest that Trollope's own experience at school might have played into this notion of tyrant boys, right? But then there's the respected tyranny and authority of the master of the hunt, right? The master of hounds, the person who's responsible for making sure all the hounds are ready. And Trollope describes kind of the tyranny that's necessary for this position and the way people kind of respect that. And just a book-to-book connection, another very interesting portrait, more extended, of a master of hounds is Lord Chiltern in the Phineas books. Okay. So before we get to the small group discussions, just a few miscellaneous items on the theme of politics and the woman questions. Sometimes when we read Trollope, we're so focused on the main characters and the main plots that we miss some of the interesting details about some of the secondary characters. And I particularly find interesting these cousins, the Palliser cousins, Iffy and Feemy. They're happily unmarried. They're busy writing wonderful letters on social matters. They devote themselves to things like, political economy and whether women should be allowed to be clerks and things like that. And they even write to Americans. And here Geoffrey, kind of mouthing Francis Trollope's sentiments, says, I hate Americans. I went there once. No one could stand to be there a month and not hate them. And it's kind of interesting because Trollope had written this book, North America, Anthony Trollope, fairly favorable to Americans, critical of the South for the Civil War, whereas Francis Trollope, I just recently got done rereading Domestic Habits of the Americans, really says she tried her hardest, but really just could not stomach most of what she saw there. Now Geoffrey has this interesting aside about how if Iffy and Feemy could sit in Parliament, they would. And then he says, oh, God forbid, a feminine House of Commons with feminine courtesies and things like that. So again, the woman question is kind of bubbling throughout this book, right? And it's interesting, what resources sustain these female cousins? Geoffrey is someone who the narrator tells her had an allowance of 500, but wanted to live on 5,000. So he has a hard time living within his means. And he even jokes to Alice that he's kind of in the market for an heiress. And does she know any? And she doesn't say, yeah, I have exactly what you want, because really she's not interested. But what kind of economic resources allow these women to have this life they have? You know, if it isn't money from their father, is it money from the Duke? You know, what is it that they are, or money from their mother? What are they living on? And also in this dinner at Matching, the Duke of St. Bungay, talking to Alice and to Glencora, says that pretty women lead men. And he wants Alice to teach him to be a radical. And Alice is thinking, oh, I wish George were here so he could benefit. Because after all, George has told her, go to Matching because these connections could help me. You know, everyone knows women have all this influence in Lady Glen, and you're a cousin of hers, so do this to help me. Okay, so it's just some interesting thoughts. So I thought to discuss in our small groups, here's a couple of things we might think about. How do you think, or what do you think of how Trollope weaves these different kinds of politics together in these chapters? We have the world of Parliament. He gives us a chapter on different kind of politicians, Plantagenet being kind of dull and not particularly brilliant, but extremely hardworking and useful. We have the politics of intimate and family relationships, including courtship and marriage, and the older generation trying to influence the younger. And we have the politics of social life, the hunt, Mrs. Greenough's suitors. I'm just wondering what you think about these different types of politics we see in these chapters. And this may be more than enough to discuss, but you might also think about, how does Trollope treat different types of influence and domination in these chapters, whether it's the pressure on Glencora to marry, whether it's the pressure that Alice is feeling from her relatives, whether it's other types of domination and influence that people are exerting. And does the narrator kind of tip his hand about whether these are good or bad? So that's it for me, and leave you to, maybe we could break into small groups and have some questions and stuff at the end.